Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tad Schnauffer, the Global National Security Institute. I'm here with Jennifer McArdle, Senior Director of Defense Programs at CAE USA and Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Thank you so much for being here, Jennifer.
Thanks, Tad. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really enjoying my time at GNSI.
Yes. And it has been an exciting conference. We want to dig a little bit more into your research. But first, I wanted to ask you, what first got you interested in national security and the defense industry?
So I've always been interested in national security. When I was a little girl, I would literally wage campaigns from a Barbie tent in my backyard. I think for many people in my generation, and you probably feel the same, you kind of grew up and came of age when 9/11 occurred, which really kind of like viscerally impacted people. I think you can talk to most anyone and they'll tell you exactly where they were. And for me, that kind of became kind of a guiding light. I knew I wanted to work on something meaningful, and I wanted to do something that was meaningful and impactful for national security. And most notably, I've always been passionate about the interplay of technology and national security. I wanted to work on technical problems that I knew could help our warfighters, which is how I ended up, getting into this space more generally, but more specifically, it was somewhat serendipitous. I was working on cyber-related issues for the DoD at the time, and the federally funded research and development center that I was a part of got this grant to run this program on what's called live, virtual, and constructive training with the former head of the Royal Canadian Air Force. And they needed a researcher to run the project, and so I ended up traveling all over the world with Lieutenant General Blondin and learning a lot about what's called synthetic training and live, virtual, and constructive training. And because I had the cyber background, I started to realize that there was this really big gap in the literature that could make a meaningful difference for the policy community and for the DoD. So that's what became the genesis of my PhD. I ended up teaching on this as a professor. And, as a researcher by training, I'm really passionate about kind of in-depth research, and I like interdisciplinary research. And some of the best research that really is occurring, in this space around, large-scale, complex synthetic environments. It just happens to be an industry. So that is kind of how I found my way leading research at a startup, guiding research programs in the space, and now I'm at a public company.
Right. So you mentioned these simulation and synthetic environments. So could you go more in depth on what those look like?
Yeah. So there's 3 different ways you can kind of define simulations. So the first is live. So this is a real person operating in a real environment. The best way to think about this, and this is typically what I would tell my students, is, with the 1986 film Top Gun, where you see Maverick flying a plane in a live training environment. So that is a live simulation. And the whole idea is that you feel that dirt, dust, and sweat of combat. The second is a virtual. So that's a real person operating a synthetic platform or system in a synthetic environment. So this can be a range of different kind of devices, anything from a multi-million-dollar full motion simulator that replicates with a high level of fidelity the inside of a fighter aircraft or a submarine, all the way down to just a simple, Oculus Rift that you could just buy, at Walmart. Right. So it's just a range of different devices. And then there's constructive simulation. So these are synthetic entities or assets operating in a synthetic environment. So you can typically think of this as like a computer game. A bunch of entities are moving around and they're operating within that kind of simulated world. And the interesting thing is these different things can be brought together in pretty novel ways. So you could have a person flying a virtual aircraft. So it's a virtual simulation, but they could be flying against constructive assets that simulate, say, adversary, red forces or aggressors. So you can start to bring these things together in pretty novel ways depending on what your experiential end goal is from a training or education standpoint, or what your analytic end goal is, whether you're experimenting to figure out what that future force should look like.
Well, and speaking of the future force and the many different elements of future combat, how do we know that these synthetic environments provide the fidelity necessary for modeling and then experimentation?
So what's interesting is in the past, everyone used to think that the most high-end training they could get, the most high-end place to experiment would be in a live environment. Right. That's not necessarily the case anymore when we think about the future of combat, or even some combat we're seeing today. Like, there's within Ukraine, we're just seeing, it's replete with, cyber and electronic operations. So when it comes to things like that, so let's say the newer domains of warfare, so, the cyber domain or the space domain or the information environment, the best way to simulate that is actually within a virtual and constructive environment. So that's a synthetic environment. And there's just a number of reasons for this. So if we were to start first with cyber, you're not going to bring live cyber into a live environment because you can inadvertently sabotage a platform. So you could put the platform at risk. You could put the operator at risk. When you think about, say, manipulating the electronic spectrum, you could theoretically undermine access to it by local civilian populations. So within a live environment, if they want to bring cyber in right now, what they typically do is they use a note card. So this is like a literal note card to inject in friction. So I'd be handing you a note card and I'd be saying, hey, Tad, your GPS has gone out. Operate like you have no GPS. And that's not really providing you really useful learning. But within a synthetic environment, you could be operating that same platform that's simulated, and I can conduct, adversarial cyber attacks against your platform. I could sabotage key functionality. I could subvert the information that's going into your system, and I could be really pushing you to the limit where you have to think creatively about how to, operate within that denied and degraded environment. So that's one way to bring, say, cyber in a much more realistic way. The space environment, simply because of the sheer cost of sending assets into space, the majority of training and experimentation that's going to take place for our guardians is going to be in these synthetic worlds, because that's really just the only way to do it, to think through like future offensive and defensive operations. So for a lot of different reasons, when we think about the future fight, we're going to be pushed more and more into these environments so that we can really kind of stress our warfighters, but also experiment in kind of new and different ways.
So it sounds like this would be a complement to the normal, maybe infantry training. So you still need to know how to shoot a rifle, you still need to know how to maybe dig a trench, but this allows you to go across domains where it just simply wouldn't be able to happen without this type of technology. So what does that look like maybe across dimes? So as you look at diplomacy, information, the military and economic elements of new future wars, how do these synthetic environments play a role there?
That's a great question. So I think the best way to start to break this down is to think about, how do you think about DIME, say, at a strategic level, when you're trying to figure out how you can use these different levers of power to shape the contours of competition or a future conflict. And then you could look at an operational level. So if there was an information operation, how do we respond, or how do we shape the information environment in a way that's advantageous to us? So let me focus, I guess, both in tandem. So the first is, right now, there's not really a good way at the strategic level to model and simulate aspects of DIME. So on the military side, we've got really good force-on-force models from an adjudication standpoint. The information environment, we're starting to see pretty good models. We're starting to understand. So for instance, you can scrape adversary kind of information operations in real time. You could build models around that. But where it gets complicated is things like culture. Culture is not something that's easily quantifiable, so it's very difficult to build models around that. There's two kind of data sets that have been developed by Hoft and Globe in the 1990s. And depending on what you're trying to measure, they're just not that compelling. And then you can think about things like economics. There's not really a good model if we were going to use sanctions, say, like we did against the Russians, to know exactly what they will and will not do. So typically what people will do is they will war game, but they'll war game with SMEs, so subject matter experts that will provide that adjudication function. So these are less rigid, kind of more ideational games. So what we're trying to do is to figure out ways where we can take advantage of classic war games, where you're given that ideation space, where we take advantage of subject matter intelligence, but we're complementing that with models where they make sense and where they're explanatory. So how do we bring in force kind of models from an adjudication standpoint and complement that with models, with people's mental models of a given country's culture? So that's, I'd say, the state of the art right now. Obviously, as better models develop, you might be able to move more towards kind of computer-based adjudication, but we're just not quite there yet. Then you could look at, say, the operational level. Sure. So there's some pretty interesting work in this space. you can right now develop a synthetic population that mimics to a high degree the population of a given group within an area of operation. So for instance, you could stand up a synthetic population of the people in Taipei or Tokyo. And you can do this based on their basic needs. Obviously, cultural attributes get tough, but for the most part, you can create these synthetic populations that are a decent kind of corollary. Right. Now, what's interesting is if you start scraping kind of data of adversary information operations in real time, you can then build those models and run those models over a synthetic population so you can see how they might react to various adversarial stimuli or various friendly force stimuli. So then let's think about that in from a training standpoint. So, you as a soldier, you recognize that not only do you need to be able to work with that population, and you need to figure out a way to, say, maneuver through that population. If you understand that, certain types of stimuli could cause unrest or cause certain problems, that might change your thinking or the various ways you might, the various things you might do to maintain mission assurance in that various kind of construct or context. So you're basically giving people tools that they haven't necessarily had before to make better decisions, to train in better ways, or to think about, from an experimentation standpoint. Obviously, the whole idea behind multi-domain operations is that you can use multiple different effects to obtain your objectives. Sure. So how can we stimulate the information environment while we're engaging in, say, traditional military type operations to achieve our ends? So you can start to figure out, are there different ways we could be doing that?
Right. So it offers you different courses of action, and then you're able to make a more informed decision.
100%.
Based off these simulation environments. Now, are they able to also go into different weaponry, say even going up to something like a nuclear weapon use on the battlefield, and maybe that effect on not just the population, but possibly the infrastructure and those type of simulations?
Yes, of course. So long as there is a good model that's out there, you can basically simulate anything. So obviously, when we think about questions like nuclear questions, simulations have been used for ages for nuclear weapons, simply because we're not really going to be detonating them live. So not just from a test and assurance standpoint, but also when we think about, all right, what should be the lay down of our nuclear forces across our nuclear triad. We can use simulation to kind of experiment with that and to think through, various constructs of deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment. So simulation, what's really powerful about it is when we think about a classic war game, typically you're operating within one course of action. You've got enough time to run through that one course of action. Within a simulated environment, you have the option of running real time, so that simulation is running at the pace of this recording. Right. Or you can run faster than real time. So you could theoretically run thousands of simulations in tandem, faster than real time, and you can start to understand the breadth of ways that something could unfold. And then you can make better decision based on that, rich amount of data. What should you do? You can start to understand the inner and kind of outer potentials of a given kind of scenario.
So it kind of gives a leader or someone who's analyzing it some ideas of what the middle ground would be. So if you run 1,000 simulations, the majority of them end up with this outcome, but you have some outliers as well.
Right.
So then you as the human have to make a decision on that.
And so that's why, sometimes when people talk about modeling and simulation, they'll talk about things like black swans for that exact reason. It's to start to kind of understand what those outliers might be so you can make better decisions around those as well. It's interesting. Even just being from Florida, just put a caveat, it has seeing the hurricane models, and then they always kind of dial in on the center, but you're not sure where it's going to go. Right. It kind of reminds me of that as you get this cone of what could happen based on the simulations. Right. But here's, So that's a good point. So I do want to caveat. So there's this great kind of saying, so all models are wrong, but some are useful. So with your hurricane model, obviously, if you're trying to prepare for a hurricane, you're going to look at that model and be like, well, it didn't tell me what it was going to do. Yeah. At the end of the day, like when we talk about synthetic environments, when we talk about modeling and simulation, this is one tool. It's a useful tool. It's not always the correct tool, but in the absence of something else, it's the best that we have.
It complements a number of other things, like you said, experience of the individual operator, decision maker, things they might have seen around the world, and then other experts, these subject matter experts that might be in the training environment.
Yes.
Well, so now we've talked a lot on the strategic operational level. What's this look like for maybe the individual leader on the tactical level, the individual soldiers that are going through these synthetic environments, and how many would be involved? Are a lot of them perhaps, run through a computer program, or do you have actual soldiers going through these training simulations?
So it depends on what you're trying to achieve from a training standpoint. But I guess let me give one example. So I'm not necessarily convinced that when we're thinking about infantry training or training the soldier on the ground, that these virtual reality devices are necessarily useful. I do think there's a useful place for augmented reality.
Okay.
So for instance, within the national training centers, you will bring in actors so that you understand, say, when you enter a village, what your standard operating procedure should be. And for very good reasons, we are not allowed to hire child actors.
Right.
But if there's no children within a village, that definitely indicates something to soldiers, that something might be amiss, something might not be up. So something awry must be going on. So you could be wearing an augmented reality goggle where you could start to bring in, simulated children. So you're walking through that physical environment, but children are there. And so you start to get that experiential learning. Now we're starting to think a lot about urban operations. And urban operations, there's this complexity and scale that you're not necessarily going to get at a national training center. So how do you bring in that complexity and scale? What if I want to show hundreds of thousands of people? We obviously can't afford to hire hundreds of thousands of actors.
Right.
So can you bring in that complexity and scale into that live environment, into a synthetic environment? The other thing we oftentimes talk about are combined arms operations.
Right.
So for, say, if you're trying to go in and clear a room, that is a physical, that needs to be a physical live experience from a training standpoint. Sure. But if I want to call in, say, support from an uncrewed system, well, maybe I can be using a virtual kind of iPad to call that in, where that environment is reflected through computer-generated entities, and I'm calling in that support that's computer-generated, and that the impact of that unmanned system or uncrewed system is reflected in a constructive environment or virtual environment. So I think there's a lot of ways, depending on what you're trying to achieve, that you can pull these things together. But you always need to start with what is that end goal from experimentation or a training standpoint. You work backwards from there in terms of what kind of technology do you really want to bring in.
Right. What tasks are those units trying to get after? And then as you start going up the echelons, those larger level strategies.
100%. Yeah.
No, that's very fascinating. And so, and you mentioned uncrewed vehicles in there. So and that's what our conference today has been about. So how does that look in these synthetic environments? The use of AI / autonomous, warfare, but also with the use of uncrewed vehicles.
So I'm a firm believer that we really need to be taking advantage of synthetic environments when we're thinking about the future of human-machine teaming.
Sure.
And to me, when we think about human-machine teaming, it's much more than just a uncrewed system. So I know we have a tendency when we think about human-machine teaming to think about drones. It's much more than that. So, obviously it can manifest like a drone. It could manifest as a person, flying alongside a loyal wingman or a collaborative combat aircraft. It could be a commander controlling a whole swarm of drones. But the other thing, it could also be a commander in a command and control center working alongside an AI-based decision support tool or an intelligence analyst working alongside a decision support tool. So there's just a lot of different ways that this can take place. Now, what's crucial when we think about human-machine teaming, and this is where I think synthetic environments come in, is the whole question of trust.
Right.
So as someone that focuses on military training, obviously I'm really interested in trust. And in the military, trust is based on predictability. It's born of training and professionalism. And then there's this fundamentally kind of emotional element to trust, because it's a willingness to cede your vulnerability to another in in environments of uncertainty, of danger. And so if we're trying to kind of understand human-machine trust, I feel like it's very useful to start with human-to-human trust.
Sure.
So what we're starting to do in synthetic environments is we can put you in a synthetic environment where you're operating alongside another human within this virtual world, and we can use sensors to measure various physiological attributes. So we can start to understand your stress levels, various kind of emotive states. And from that data, we can build this model of of various attributes of trust. And that model can then be used within a synthetic environment to start to understand what human-machine trust could look like as well. So then we could basically use that model and pair a human with an algorithm that's a constructive generated, say, plane or something like that. So there's just a bunch of different ways to start to experiment with this, to better understand this from a research standpoint. And once you figure that out, well, then you can start to think about, all right, well, now let's think about future, concepts where we're going to apply that to an entire swarm or within this kind of operational construct or whatever. It's, a useful research tool to expand outwards.
So these synthetic environments would also allow the number of repetitions, I would imagine, to start building that consistency that would build trust as well, which you might not be able to afford in real life to constantly be flying a drone or a submarine that's uncrewed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's such a good point because obviously, if trust is based on predictability, it's because you've gone through multiple reps and sets with your, with that unit. So if you can run through multiple reps and sets with your machine teammate, that also you start to understand the inner and outer bounds of how that machine operates. So you start to develop a level of kind of predictability within that machine teammate, and that machine also starts to understand you as a human operator. And then, of course, I think there's a tendency to get very kind of concerned from a safety standpoint around autonomous systems, and synthetic environments provide that safe place for things to fail where you don't have to worry about, the human operator or, other kind of collateral type damage.
Right. And within this synthetic environment, how do you see the future moving on, particularly with the information space like social media? Is there a role that can play in synthetic environments as you're trying to feel out culture or you're trying to gauge a public opinion or something like that within populations?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're seeing some really interesting work from a big data standpoint where you're starting to understand what causes things to be viral. I mean, you can also, what's really interesting is, you just think about the way you are targeted online when it comes to, I don't know, like Amazon, like the books you buy or the adverts that are shown to you. I mean, essentially, that is a model of your decision making. It might not be, it's an imperfect model, but I won't deny, I mean, I click on a lot of the adverts that come my way. So it's a pretty damn good model. And so, if we're able to build decent models from a big data standpoint of given individuals or given population, you can start to think about how powerful that could be within a synthetic environment to start to understand, okay, if I were to use this stimuli, how would people react on a more kind of macro level? Now, of course, there's privacy concerns with a lot of this. Yeah. The interesting thing is there's actually a lot of data that is open source that's out there that you can use to start to construct decent kind of views from the aggregate macro population level all the way down to the individual level.
Right. Yeah, because what you possibly could do, and just experimenting with this here, was that you could take like a bunch of tweets of people in a particular neighborhood and see if they were, say, pro-American if you were going to do an operation there. And then you might be more welcome in this neighborhood compared to another one where you're getting more maybe radical tweets or something like that.
Yes, 100%. And so, I mean, what you're getting at is like this really kind of interesting space where right now we think about these synthetic environments as these environments that you use before the first sorties fire, right? So it's used for test, for training, for experimentation. But then these same kind of environments could still be used for a common operating picture in an actual operation itself. Yes. So while we're not there yet, that's like the natural kind of progression where, these kind of experimentation and training data can feed operational data and vice versa. And you start to see this interesting flow between the two, or you're using the same infrastructure or tools.
Sure. So, and as we kind of wind down here with the interview, how long do you think these synthetic environments will take to implement or to be used widely across maybe not just the U.S. military, but maybe our allies and partners? I mean, I know they're already partially being used, but when do we see this happening where soldiers wearing maybe the goggles that allow them to participate in this widespread?
So, virtual and constructive simulations are used throughout a lot of our allies and partners in different forms. There's different levels of adoption. So certain countries have definitely really leaned into these technical tools. The Australians are a good example of this. They are really high adopters of live virtual and constructive training tools. The British actually, which is really interesting, they are right now trying to develop an entirely new kind of program to transform their army, where they're starting to look at applications like this, where they can start to bring these virtual and constructive training tools into live environments to provide much more rigorous training for their soldiers, but also training that's not just at the individual level, but all the way up to the division level. So certainly, a lot of different countries are experimenting with this in different ways. What's interesting for the U.S., I think, as we watch our allies and partners, is sometimes places can be far more forward-leaning because maybe, at least in the Australian case, they are situated in a place where it's geopolitically more contested and problematic. And, sometimes smaller militaries can move a little bit faster, or they're willing to take slightly more risk when it comes to adopting certain tools. So I think it's in our interest to constantly watch how militaries think about adopting these tools, the kind of innovations and adaptations they make when they organizationally adopt these tools, and whether there's lessons learned for us. Because we obviously, as Americans, I think we tend to think about innovation diffusing from the core to the periphery.
Right. Yeah.
But there's really good ideas also in the periphery as well that we can start bringing back to the core so that we can adapt and innovate as well when we think about the use of these tools.
So speaking of looking at places that adapt and innovate, as our final question, what movie or book do you really look to that kind of somehow touches on synthetic environments that's very interesting and has inspired you? Now, you mentioned Top Gun. You also mentioned Waging Wars out of a Barbie tent. I don't know if the Barbie movie does that, but which movie or books would you recommend if someone's like, I'm interested, I'd like to get into this a little bit more?
So Ready Player One, I guess, is a good example.
Right.
It's a natural example because, he's operating within this virtual world. The other one, I guess, is Ender's Game.
Yeah,
That's another one that people like to talk about. And I guess what I like about Ender's Game is you're operating within this virtual world, but then you start to realize that actually the actual operation itself is taking place within those virtual tools. So when we think about, that kind of interplay between these virtual and constructive simulations in the actual operational environment, I think we're starting to see things coming together. So for instance, we were at a conference where we were talking about remotely piloted vehicles and autonomous systems. Well, the same training system that you're going to use to learn to pilot a remotely piloted vehicle is the same as the actual system you're going to use to pilot that remotely piloted vehicle. And so I think more and more and more we're going to be moving in a direction where those two things aren't actually that different. And so, you have it has interesting implications for acquisitions, for experimentation, just, all sorts of different things.
Well, it sounds like a very exciting future in the reality and also in the virtual environment. So thank you so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.